I remember when Kaled still had color, or at least I think I do, though the memory feels like something borrowed from another man's life, a fading dream that slips through my fingers each time I try to hold it, and now all I see is rust and decay, the land itself bleeding crimson under a sky that hangs like a bruise that never heals. The trumpet sounded at dawn, though dawn means nothing here anymore, just a gradual shift from black to crimson, and I strapped on my armor with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the rot that had begun its slow work beneath my fingernails, tiny flecks of orange-red that spread like wildfire through dry grass, and I wondered if today would be the day I finally collapsed like Gregor did, screaming as his flesh liquefied inside his breastplate. They call us Redmanes, soldiers of General Radahn, and once that title meant something, pride, swelling in my chest when I marched beneath his banner, but now it tastes like ash on my tongue, bitter and choking, because we are not soldiers anymore, but ghosts, haunting a battlefield that refuses to end, fighting enemies that cannot die in a war that has no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. The smell hits me first every morning, that sickly, sweet stench of rotting meat mixed with something else, something fungal and wet, and it clings to everything, my armor, my skin, my hair, seeping into my lungs with each breath, until I cannot remember what clean air tastes like, and I have learned not to look too closely at the lesions that blossom on my arms, purple and weeping, because looking makes them real. We march toward the swamp of Aeonia again, the same route we have marched for months or years or perhaps decades. Time has lost meaning in this place where the sun never moves and the rot never sleeps, and I step over bodies that I recognize, men I shared rations with, men whose names I have forgotten, their flesh sagging off their bones like wet paper, their eyes empty sockets filled with crawling things. Captain Jeren leads us still, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that no longer matter, and I see the desperation in his eyes, even through his helmet, the knowledge that we are already dead, but too stubborn or too cursed to lie down, and he speaks of holding the line, of our duty to the general, but I have seen Radahn, what remains of him, a godlike warrior reduced to a feral beast that devours corpses on that cursed beach, and I wonder what duty means to a god who has forgotten he was ever human. The ground beneath my feet squelches with each step, soft and yielding like rotten fruit, and I see mushrooms the size of trees sprouting from what used to be watchtowers, their caps dripping with viscous fluid that hisses when it touches metal, and there are flowers too, beautiful, horrible flowers with petals like diseased tongues, and they sing sometimes in the wind, a humming that gets inside my head and makes me forget why I am walking, where I am going, who I was before the rot. My sword arm aches constantly now, the joints swollen and hot, and I have tied the grip with extra leather strips because my fingers no longer close properly, the tendons stiff and unyielding, and during the last skirmish I watched my sword slip from my grasp mid-swing, tumbling through the air in slow motion while the clean-rotten knight's blade found the gap between my pauldron and gorget, and I felt the cold sting of steel, and then the hot rush of blood, and I did not die. I never die. None of us do. We just bleed and rot and continue. There is a peculiar mathematics to suffering here, I have discovered, each wound adding to the sum of degradation, each breath bringing me closer to some final equation I cannot solve, and I have stopped praying to any god, because the gods are either dead or mad or worse. They are watching, and they do not care, and the Erd tree's distant glow mocks us with its golden promise of grace that we will never know again. I saw Millicent, or someone who looked like a young woman with red hair, walking through the rot fields as if they were spring meadows, and she moved with such purpose, such clarity, that I wanted to call out to ask how she maintained hope in this place where hope comes to. But my voice failed me, choked by the thick mucus that fills my throat and she passed by without seeing me. Just another rotting soldier in a field of rotting soldiers. The nights are worse than the days, if night and day even exist as separate things anymore, because in the darkness I hear them, my brothers in arms, crying out from where they have fallen, begging for water or mercy or death, and I have learned to distinguish between the living and the dead by the quality of their screams. The living still have that edge of hope, that belief that someone might come, while the dead just wail mindlessly, trapped in bodies that refuse to release them. My dreams when sleep finally claims me are strange, fragmented things, memories of a life before that feel like they belong to someone else, a farm perhaps, golden fields of wheat under a blue sky, and there is a woman's laugh, bright and clear, and the smell of bread baking, and I wake with tears on my face that burn like acid because they are mixed with the rot, and I realize I cannot remember the woman's name, or if she was even real, or just another lie my mind tells itself to survive another day. We found a supply cache last week, hidden in the ruins of what used to be a watchtower, and inside were sealed casks of clean water and dried meat, and even some boluses designed to slow the scarlet rot, and we fell upon it like starving dogs, desperate and shameless. But when I drank the water, it tasted wrong, metallic and bitter, and I realized my tongue was so corrupted that I could no longer recognize purity, that the rot had rewritten even my senses. There are rumors among the men, whispered in the brief moments when we huddle together for warmth, though warmth is another thing we have forgotten the meaning of, rumors that somewhere beyond Caelid's borders the world continues, that people live normal lives in places where the ground is solid and the air does not shimmer with spores. But I do not believe these rumors anymore. I think this rot is all there is, all there has ever been, and those memories of a world before are just collective. I watched Marcus try to desert 2 days ago, or was it 2 months? He simply stopped marching and turned toward the horizon, walking with mechanical determination toward the distant border of Caelid. And none of us stopped him because we understood. We all understood, but we saw him again this morning, or someone wearing his armor, shambling in circles near the dragon barrow, his face hidden by his helmet, but his movements wrong, jerky and purposeless, and I wondered if his mind had finally broken completely, or if something else was wearing his skin. The general appears, sometimes on the horizon, a massive silhouette against the crimson sky, and we are supposed to feel inspired by his presence, reassured that our commander still fights. But I have seen what he does when he thinks no one is watching, how he digs through the battlefield with his hands, searching for corpses to consume, his magnificent armor caked with filth, his legendary blades dragging through the muck, and I want to look away, but I cannot, because there is a horrible fascination in watching a god reduced to this, and I wonder if this is what awaits us all, not death, but degradation without end. My shield arm gave out completely yesterday, the rot having eaten through the muscle and ligament until the bones moved freely in their sockets, grinding together with each movement, and I let the shield fall because I no longer had the strength to hold it, and because I no longer saw the point. Shields are for those who still believe they might survive, and I know now with absolute certainty that survival is not an option, only variation in the manner of our dissolution. There was a letter in my pack once, written in a hand I do not recognize, speaking of love and home and promises to return, and I read it sometimes when the pain becomes too much, trying to remember if I wrote it, or if it was written to me, but the words have begun to fade, the ink running together from moisture or blood or tears, and soon there will be nothing left but blank parchment, and perhaps that is better, perhaps forgetting is the only mercy this place offers. The clean rot nights are our primary enemy, though enemy feels like too strong a word for what we do. We meet on the battlefield and exchange blows like actors in a play that has run too long, their rot fighting our rot, two forms of decay locked in eternal combat. And sometimes I wonder if they were once soldiers like us, if beneath those elegant armor plates and flowing capes are men who also remember better days. I counted my wounds this morning out of some compulsion I do not understand, running my fingers over the raised scars and open lesions and places where bone shows through corrupted flesh, and I lost count after 37, and I laughed, a sound like breaking glass, because what does it matter, one wound or 1,000? We are all walking corpses pretending to be soldiers. The supply wagons stopped coming months ago, or perhaps years. Time is fluid here, elastic and meaningless, and we survive by scavenging from the dead, taking their rations and their weapons and sometimes their armor when our own finally crumbles. And there is no shame in this anymore. Shame requires the existence of standards, and standards require a world that makes sense. I saw my reflection in a puddle today, the water rust-colored and thick, and for a moment I did not recognize the face staring back at me, the skin mottled purple and orange, the eyes sunken deep in their sockets, the lips cracked and bleeding, and I realized I had become one of them, one of the hollow things that shamble through Caelid, making the motions of life, while life itself has long since departed. There are songs we used to sing, marching songs about glory and honor and the general's might, but no one sings anymore because the rot has taken our voices, leaving only rasping whispers and wet coughs. And besides, the songs feel like mockery now, empty words celebrating virtues that dissolved like sugar in rain the moment we set foot in this cursed land. The scarlet aeonia blooms are everywhere, massive flowers the color of infected wounds, and they pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. And sometimes, when I stare at them too long, I feel myself falling into that rhythm, my own heart sinking with their terrible pulse, and I have to look away before I lose myself entirely, though part of me wonders if losing myself might be preferable to maintaining this degraded consciousness. We encountered a group of tarnished yesterday, outsiders, who came seeking something in these rotland, and they looked at us with horror and pity, and I wanted to warn them to run, to flee, before Caelid claimed them too, but my voice would not work, and they passed us by, and I knew, with terrible certainty, that I would see them again, transformed, hollow-eyed and shambling, another addition to this army of the damned. My memories have begun to contradict each other. I remember having a son, but also being an only child. I remember dying in battle, but also surviving. I remember my mother's face, but it keeps changing, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel, sometimes not human at all. And I think the rot is not just consuming my flesh, but my history, eating backwards through my life until there will be nothing left, not even the ghost of who I was. The pain has become so constant that it no longer registers as pain, but as a kind of background noise, a humming that accompanies every thought and action, and I have learned to function within it the way fish function in water. It is simply the medium through which I exist, and I am terrified of what it will mean if the pain ever stops, if that will be the moment I finally cross from damaged to destroyed. There is a cathedral in the distance, its spires twisted and wrong, and we march past it every day on our endless patrol, and I have never been inside, though sometimes I hear chanting from within, low and rhythmic, and once I saw figures moving in the windows, tall shapes that did not move like men, and I wonder if worship continues there, and if so, to what God, and what could possibly be worth worshipping in this place where divinity has become monstrous. I found a flower yesterday, a small thing growing in the shadow of a broken column, and it was blue, clean blue like the sky I barely remember, and I knelt beside it for what might have been hours, just staring at this impossible fragment of beauty. And when I finally stood to continue my march, I looked back, and the flower was gone, and I do not know if it was ever there, or if my mind has begun manufacturing hallucinations to make the horror bearable. The other soldiers avoid eye contact now. We move as a unit, but each of us is utterly alone, trapped in our own private dissolution. And I think this is intentional, that the rot does not just destroy bodies, but relationships, bonds. anything that might give us strength to resist, because isolation is its own kind of death, slower and more thorough than any blade. My armor has fused to my skin in places, the metal corroding and bonding with corrupted flesh, and I no longer try to remove it because I think if I did I would peel away too much of myself, that the armor has become part of my body or my body has become part of the armor. And either way I am more object than man now, a rusting weapon in a war no one remembers starting. There was a moment last week, brief and disorienting, when the wind shifted and I caught the scent of something clean, maybe rain from distant land, and for that single instant I remembered what it felt like to be alive, truly alive, not this shambling half-existence, but vital and whole. And then the wind shifted again, and the rot stench returned, and I fell to my knees weeping, because that single breath of clean air was more painful than any wound. We lost half our unit in the last engagement, though lost is perhaps the wrong word, because they are still out there, lying where they fell, and I can hear them breathing, labored and wet, and sometimes they call out names that no one answers, and I know I should go to them, should offer what comfort I can, but I am too tired and too afraid that helping them will mean joining them, lying in the muck, waiting for death that never comes. The stars are wrong here. When I can see them through the perpetual haze, they form patterns I do not recognize, constellations that seem to shift and writhe like living things, and I wonder if we are even in the same world anymore, if Kaled has slipped sideways into some other reality where different laws apply, where suffering is the only constant and mercy is a fairy tale. I tried to count the days once, scratching marks into my armor plate, one for each sunrise, but the marks began to fade almost as soon as I made them, the metal corroding too quickly, and besides, I realized I had made 17 marks in a single day, that my sense of time had completely deteriorated, and I gave up because what does it matter how long we have been here? Duration implies beginning and end, and we have neither. There are children sometimes, or things that look like children, standing at the edges of the battlefield watching us with ancient eyes, and they do not speak, but I can hear them anyway, whispers in the back of my mind suggesting things, terrible things, ways to end the pain that involve becoming something else, something worse, and I am terrified of how tempting those whispers are becoming. My sword broke today, the blade snapping clean through during a clash with a clean rotten knight, and I stared at the broken stub in my hand and felt nothing, no loss, no fear, just a vague sense of relief, because perhaps now I have an excuse to stop fighting, to simply stand still and let whatever comes next finally arrive. But then I picked up a discarded spear and continued, because stopping is not an option. We are not allowed to stop. The rot dreams for me now, I think, when I sleep, I see through eyes that are not my own, experiencing desires and hungers I do not recognize, and I wake unsure if I am myself, or if I am becoming a vessel for something else, if the rot is not just a disease, but a form of consciousness that slowly overwrites whatever it touches, and I find myself doing things I do not remember deciding to do, speaking words I do not remember forming. There was a man named Thomas in my unit, at least I think that was his name, and he used to tell jokes, terrible jokes that made everyone groan, but we laughed anyway because laughter was rare and precious. And one day I realized I had not heard his voice in weeks, and I looked around and could not find him. And I asked the others if they remembered Thomas, and they looked at me with blank faces, and I think perhaps I invented him, a phantom companion to make the loneliness less absolute. The General's Festival is coming, they say, though I do not know who they are or why I believe them, a great gathering where we will finally put our commander to rest. And I feel nothing about this, no grief, no relief, just empty acknowledgement. And I wonder if I will survive the festival or if I even want to, if ending might be better than continuing this endless patrol. My left eye has gone dark, the rot finally reaching the delicate tissue, and I watch the world now through a single lens. Depth perception gone, colors fading, and I think about how appropriate this is. that my vision narrows as my options narrow, that I am literally becoming unable to see clearly in a world that stopped making sense long ago. There are moments of perfect clarity still, brief flashes where the fog lifts, and I understand exactly where I am and what has happened to me, and these moments are worse than the confusion, because with clarity comes the full weight of horror, the complete understanding of how far I have fallen and how much further there is to fall, and I find myself praying for the confusion to return, for madness to claim me completely. I saw a bird once flying overhead, and I watched it until my neck ached from craning upward, and I envied that bird more than I have ever envied anything, its ability to simply leave, to rise above this rot and fly toward clean lands, and I imagined what it would feel like to have wings, to escape not through death, but through transformation into something that could survive sky and wind. The trumpet sounds again, calling us to march, and I rise from where I have been sitting, though I do not remember sitting down, and I take my place in the formation, a rotting soldier among rotting soldiers, and we begin to move toward some objective I do not understand, fighting a war that ended before it began. And this is my existence now, this is what it means to be a Redmane in Caelid, to be caught between death and life, forever marching, forever rotting, forever remembering that we were once men. The battlefield stretches before me, endless and red, and I take another step forward because that is all I know how to do anymore, and the rot continues its work beneath my skin, patient and thorough, and I think about nothing, because thinking hurts worse than any wound, and I march and I march and I march. There was a time before this, I know there was, though the specifics have dissolved into a haze of contradictory impressions, and I try to grasp at the fragments, but they slip away like smoke, leaving only the aftertaste of loss, and I wonder if this forgetting is worse than the rot itself, because at least the rot is honest in its destruction. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is, while memory lies, offering false comfort in the form of half-remembered joys that may never have existed. I remember recruitment, or I think I do, a square filled with young men eager for glory, and there were banners snapping in clean wind and speeches about honor and service, and I raised my hand along with the others, swearing oaths I did not fully understand, binding myself to a cause that seemed righteous in the abstract, but has revealed itself to be nothing more than slow annihilation dressed in military regalia. The training grounds were somewhere north, I think, or maybe east. Direction has lost meaning along with so much else, but I remember the weight of the practice sword in my hand, heavier than I expected, and the instructor's voice calling out forms and techniques, and there was camaraderie then, bonds forming between men who shared hardship and aspiration, and I wonder what happened to those men, if any of them stand beside me now in this rotting formation, transformed beyond recognition. My first posting was to a watchtower on Caelid's border, back when borders still meant something, back when we believed we could contain the rot, keep it from spreading beyond this cursed region, and I stood watch at night, staring into the crimson darkness and telling myself that this duty mattered, that we were protecting something, though I could never quite articulate what that something was. The rot came slowly at first, so slowly we did not recognize it as invasion, just a discoloration in the soil, a strange smell on the wind, mushrooms appearing where none had grown before, and we reported these changes up the chain of command and received reassurances that everything was under control, that the best minds were studying the phenomenon, that we should simply maintain our positions and trust in the general's wisdom. But the rot was patient in a way that men are not. It did not rush or announce itself with trumpets and war cries. It simply crept forward, inch by inch, transforming everything it touched, and by the time we understood what was happening, it was already too late. The watchtower's foundation had begun to crumble, the water in our well-tasted strange, and the sentries started developing rashes that would not heal. I watched the first man fall to the rot, a young soldier named Peter, who could not have been more than 19, and it started with a cough, dry and persistent, and then came the lesions, small at first, but spreading with terrifying speed, and the medics tried everything they knew, but nothing worked, nothing even slowed it down, and Peter died screaming, his body dissolving from the inside out, and we burned his corpse and told ourselves he was an isolated case, that the rest of us would be fine. We were not fine, of course. None of us were fine. And within weeks, half the garrison showed symptoms, and the other half tried to maintain the fiction of normalcy, executing our duties with mechanical precision while pretending not to notice the rot creeping up our own bodies. And I think that might have been the moment we truly lost, not when the rot claimed our flesh, but when we chose denial over action, when we decided that following orders was more important than acknowledging reality. The evacuation order never came, or if it did, it never reached us, the supply lines having broken down as the rot consumed the roads and the couriers who travelled them, and we were left in our watchtower, watching the world turn crimson. And eventually we stopped waiting for rescue and simply accepted that this was our fate, to stand guard over nothing, defending a border that had already been breached, maintaining a discipline that served no purpose beyond giving structure to our dissolution. I remember the day we abandoned the watchtower. Though abandon is perhaps too active a word for what we did, we simply stopped going inside, the structure having become so corrupted that the walls wept bloody moisture and the air inside burned our lungs, and we made camp in the ruins nearby, and that was when Captain Geron found us, or what remained of us, 7 men from an original garrison of 35. Geron looked almost normal then, his armor clean and his eyes clear, and he told us we were being reassigned to the main army, that General Radahn was marshalling all available forces for a great offensive that would drive the rot back once and for all, and we believed him because we needed to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that there was no plan, no strategy, no hope of victory, only endless holding actions against an enemy that could not be defeated. The main encampment was chaos, hundreds of soldiers in various stages of rot, all pressed together, and the organization that should have existed had long since broken down, units mixed together randomly, command structure fractured, orders contradicting each other, and I realized that we were not an army anymore but a mob, held together only by habit and the distant presence of the general. I saw Radahn for the first time from a distance, mounted on his skeletal horse, and even then, before the rot had fully claimed him, there was something wrong. His movements too erratic, his size somehow unnatural, and the other soldiers whispered that he had challenged the stars themselves and won, that he held back the very heavens through sheer force of will, and I wanted to find comfort in his legendary strength, but all I felt was dread. The offensive began at what I assume was dawn, though the sun was hidden behind perpetual haze, and we marched in formation toward the swamp of Aeonia, and I felt a strange excitement then, a belief that finally we were going to do something, take action instead of just rotting away, and I gripped my spear tightly and moved forward with purpose, and for those first few hours I almost felt like a soldier again. The clean rot knights met us at the swamp's edge, their formation perfect, their movements coordinated, and they cut through our ranks like a scythe through wheat, and I watched men I had shared meals with fall apart, literally fall apart, their corrupted bodies unable to withstand even glancing blows, and the ground became a slurry of blood and mud and body parts, and still we pushed forward because retreating was not an option. Retreat had never been an option. I killed my first clean rot knight that day, drove my spear through a gap in their armor, and felt the resistance of flesh, and then the horrible sensation of that flesh dissolving around my weapon. And when I pulled the spear free, it was coated in something that was not quite blood, more like thick sap, and the knight did not fall, but instead lunged at me with renewed fury, and I understood then that they were like us, neither living nor dead, trapped in the same terrible limbo. We fought for hours or days, time losing meaning in the chaos of battle, and eventually I could not tell if we were advancing or retreating or simply moving in circles. The landscape all looked the same, crimson mud and twisted vegetation and bodies that would not stay down, and my arms moved mechanically, thrusting and parrying, my mind disconnecting from my actions as a protection against the horror. The offensive ended not with victory or defeat, but with exhaustion, both sides simply stopping, too degraded to continue, and we dragged ourselves back to camp having gained nothing and lost everything that remained of our humanity. And no one spoke of the battle afterward. There was nothing to say. It had been pointless, and we all knew it, just another ritual in a war that had transcended purpose. That was months ago or years, or perhaps it is still happening. Perhaps I am still in that battle, and everything since has been a dying dream. And I would prefer that explanation honestly, because it would mean there is an end coming, a moment when my body finally gives out and I can stop. But I know it is not true. I know I survived that day and many days since, survived in the worst possible sense of the word. The rot has stages, I have learned, progression that is predictable in its horror, and I am somewhere in the middle stages now, past the initial lesions and tissue softening, but not yet at the final transformation, where consciousness dissolves and only hunger remains, and I can see my future in the soldiers around me who are further along, shambling things that barely respond to command, their minds already gone, even as their bodies continue to move. There is a soldier in my unit, I do not know his name, who has reached the final stage, his face completely obscured by fungal growth, his armor fused so thoroughly to his body that I cannot tell where metal ends and flesh begins, and he follows the formation by some instinct or memory, his movements synchronized with ours, and sometimes at night I hear him weeping, a sound like wind through a hollow tree, and I wonder if anything human remains inside that corrupted shell. I have started having conversations with people who are not there, long dialogues with absent friends or family members whose faces I can no longer quite remember, and I know this is a bad sign, that my mind is beginning to fracture under the strain, but I cannot stop because these imaginary conversations are the only thing that feels real anymore, the only moments when I can pretend I am still a person capable of connection. The other day, I spent an hour arguing with my father about crop rotation, a detailed technical discussion about soil nutrients and planting schedules, and his advice was sound and practical, and only afterward did I remember that my father died when I was 12, and even if he had lived, he was a blacksmith, not a farmer, and I have no idea where that conversation came from, what fragment of overheard knowledge or invented memory my deteriorating mind had stitched together into this false interaction. I catch myself speaking out loud sometimes, narrating my actions to an audience that does not exist, and the other soldiers have stopped looking at me strangely when I do this because they do it too. We are all trapped in our own private theatres, performing one-man shows for empty houses, and maybe this is the rot's final cruelty, not just destroying our bodies, but fragmenting our minds so thoroughly that we cannot even find solidarity in shared suffering. There are good days still, or what pass for good days in this place, mornings when the pain is slightly less, when my thoughts achieve something approaching coherence, when I can almost remember what it felt like to have hope, and on those days I clean my weapon, tend to my armor as best I can with corroded hands, and I tell myself that discipline matters, that maintaining these rituals proves I am still human, still a soldier rather than just a mobile corpse. But the good days are becoming rarer, the space between them stretching longer, and I know what this means even if I refuse to acknowledge it directly. I am running out of time. Whatever reserves of humanity I have been drawing on are nearly depleted, and soon I will cross that invisible threshold beyond which there is no returning, where the rot completes its work, and transforms me into one of those hollow, shambling things that haunt the deepest parts of Caelid. I found a journal yesterday tucked into the breastplate of a fallen soldier, and I read it hoping for insight or comfort or connection, and the entries started coherent, detailed accounts of daily life in the regiment, complaints about food and weather and officers, the normal grievances of military life. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting deteriorated, the entries becoming shorter and more fragmented, and the final pages were just repeated phrases, the same 3 words written over and over until the ink ran out, and those words were simply, "I am rotting." I burned the journal, not wanting to carry that evidence of inevitable decline, but the words stayed with me, echoing in my skull, and I find myself thinking them now. I am rotting, a simple statement of fact that contains multitudes of horror, and I wonder if my own decline is following the same pattern, if I am becoming less complex, less nuanced, my personality and history compressing down into this single reality. I am rotting, until that is all I am, all I ever was, all I will ever be. The supply situation has become critical. Not that supplies matter much when your body is more rot than flesh, but we still go through the motions, rationing out mouldy bread and brackish water, and sometimes I watch newer soldiers, recruits or reinforcements who arrived more recently and have not yet fully degraded, and they eat with such determination, such belief that nutrition matters, and I want to tell them to save their strength, that eating is just postponing the inevitable. But I say, nothing, because maybe that postponement is all we have. Maybe those few extra days or hours of marginal functionality are worth fighting for. There was a raid last week on a clean rot supply depot, and we captured several crates of preservative boluses, medicine designed to slow the rot's progression, and the distribution of these precious items nearly started a riot, soldiers fighting each other with desperate savagery for a chance at a few more days of clarity, and I watched from the sidelines, too exhausted to fight, and in the end I received nothing, and I told myself I did not care, that a few more days of awareness just meant a few more days of suffering. But that was a lie. I wanted those boluses, I wanted that postponement, I wanted to not want them. We found a village yesterday, or what remained of one, and the buildings were still mostly intact, crimson vines growing through the roofs, but walls still standing, and for a moment I felt excited, thinking we might find supplies or shelter, or even survivors. But when we entered the largest building, we discovered why it had been abandoned. The entire population had gathered in what must have been a meeting hall, and then sealed themselves inside, and they lay there still, hundreds of bodies in all, various states of decay, and they had all died holding hands, forming a great circle, and I wondered what ritual or suicide pact had led to this, and whether their end had been more merciful than ours. There were children among the dead in that village, and this broke something in me that I had thought was already thoroughly broken, seeing small bodies twisted by rot, their innocence violated by this indiscriminate corruption, and I stumbled outside and vomited, though what came up was more black bile than anything resembling food, and I knelt there in the crimson mud asking questions I knew had no answers. Why them? Why this? Why any of it? And the only response was the wind carrying spores and the distant sound of combat that never ends. Captain Geron ordered us to search the village for anything useful, and we moved through the ruins mechanically, opening doors and cabinets and chests, finding nothing but more evidence of interrupted lives, and in one house I discovered a child's toy, a wooden horse with a mane made of real hair, and it was so perfectly preserved, untouched by rot, and I sat there holding this toy for longer than I should have, this small, perfect thing in a world where nothing else remained perfect. And when I finally put it down, my hands were We made camp in the village that night, despite the bodies, despite the obvious wrongness of the place, because even rotting soldiers need to rest, and I lay awake, listening to my comrades' breathing, those wet, laboured sounds that barely qualified as breath. And I thought about the people who had lived here, who had built these homes and raised these children and believed in futures that would never arrive, and I wondered if they had known, in those final moments, that they were luckier than us, that a chosen death was preferable to this endless diminishment. Morning came with no discernible difference in light quality, just a subtle shift in the tone of the crimson haze, and we left the village without ceremony, continuing our eternal patrol, and within an hour I could barely remember what the village had looked like, the details blurring together with 100 other ruined settlements, and I wondered if this forgetting was protective, my mind refusing to store memories of horror that it had no room for, prioritizing whatever minimal functioning remained. I saw Radahn again yesterday, closer this time, and the deterioration since my last glimpse was shocking, his armor hanging loose on a frame that seemed to have collapsed inward, his horse barely able to support his weight despite his apparent wasting, and he moved across the battlefield in a strange, hunched posture, and I heard him speaking, though no one was near him, long, rambling monologues about stars and gravity, and promises made to someone named Miquella, and I understood then that his mind had gone, that whatever genius had once guided him had been consumed by the rot, leaving only fragments and obsession. The other soldiers still speak of the general with reverence, still claim that he holds back the stars through force of will, protecting the world from cosmic devastation, but I look at him and see only another victim, more powerful than us but suffering the same degradation, and if even a demigod can fall this far, then what hope do ordinary men have? What purpose is there in struggling against the inevitable when the strongest among us has been reduced to a beast that feeds on corpses and speaks to ghosts? We crossed through a region yesterday that I think might have been farmland once, the topology suggesting cultivation, gentle rolling hills that would have caught rain and sun in optimal proportions. But now the earth itself has transformed into something that resembles flesh more than soil, pulsing slightly with each step I take, and the crops that grow here are nothing I recognize, twisted stalks with bulbous growths that leak fluids when disturbed, and the smell is overwhelming, sweet decay, mixed with something almost perfume-like. And I watched one soldier lean down to examine a particularly large growth, and when he touched it, the thing burst, coating him in spores so thick they looked like fog, and he breathed them in before he could stop himself, and within minutes his eyes had glazed over, and he wandered off the path, and no one went after him because we all understood there was no point. I have begun to notice patterns in the rot, variations that suggest something almost like intention, as if the corruption is not random but follows certain rules or preferences, consuming some materials faster than others, transforming flesh and wood and metal in different ways, and I wonder if this is really just a disease or if it is something more, some form of hostile consciousness that seeks not just to destroy but to remake, to impose its own alien logic on a world that operates by different principles, and the thought terrifies me more than simple death ever could, because death is at least familiar. Death follows rules I understand, but transformation into something other, something that thinks and wants in ways I cannot comprehend, that is a horror that reaches deeper. There was music last night, drifting across the battlefield from some unknown source, and it was beautiful in a way that made my chest ache, haunting melodies that seemed to come from every direction and no direction, and I saw other soldiers stop and tilt their heads, listening with expressions I had not seen in months, something approaching peace, and I wondered if this was another symptom of degradation, auditory hallucinations brought on by rot-damaged brains, or if there really was someone out there playing music in this wasteland, some mad artist who had decided that beauty was the appropriate response to horror. The music made me remember things I thought I had forgotten completely, a festival from childhood, paper lanterns floating into the night sky while musicians played, and there was dancing, clumsy, enthusiastic dancing, and I remember the joy of movement, of body doing what you told it to without pain or resistance, and I tried to move now in time with the phantom music, but my legs would not cooperate, the joints too stiff, the muscles too corrupted, and I fell and lay there in the mud, listening to the music fade, and I cried, but no tears came because even my tear ducts have stopped functioning properly. We encountered merchants yesterday, or what I assume were merchants, travellers in ragged cloaks pulling a cart loaded with goods, and they moved through Caelid as if the rot did not exist. And when they saw us, they stopped and began displaying their wares, bottles and potions and strange implements, and their prices were absurd, demanding runes we did not possess for cures that could not possibly work. And yet several soldiers approached them, desperate enough to try anything, and I watched. Transactions occur, worthless promises exchanged for equally worthless remedies, and the merchants moved on, and the soldiers who had purchased their wares clutched the bottles like holy relics, and I knew those bottles contained nothing but coloured water, or worse, but I said nothing because what right did I have to take away even false hope? There are dogs here, or things that were dogs once, hairless creatures with exposed muscle tissue and too many legs, and they follow our unit at a distance, and sometimes at night I hear them making sounds that are almost like barking, but wrong, harmonics that should not exist in canine throats, and one night I woke to find one of them standing over me, its eyeless face pointed directly at mine, and I did not move, barely breathed, and after a moment that felt like hours it turned and loped away, and I do not know what it wanted or why it chose not to attack, and I am grateful and disturbed in equal measure. My armor has developed holes that I cannot account for, not damage from weapons, but corrosion that has eaten through the metal in strange patterns, almost like words, in a language I do not recognize, and I have caught myself tracing these patterns with my fingers during rest periods, trying to decode meaning that probably does not exist, but the human mind is desperate for pattern and significance even in randomness, and I cannot stop myself from searching for messages in the decay, as if the rot itself is trying to communicate. We passed a mirror yesterday intact somehow, standing alone in the ruins of what might have been a manor house, and I made the mistake of looking into it, and what I saw was so much worse than I had imagined. My face barely recognizable, skin the color of spoiled meat, one eye clouded completely white, my mouth pulled into a permanent grimace by lesions that had tightened the muscles, and I understood why the other soldiers avoid looking at each other, why we communicate in grunts and gestures, rather than facing each other directly, because seeing what we have become is more painful than any wound. But the worst part of my reflection was not the physical corruption, but the expression, or lack thereof. My face had become a mask, incapable of conveying emotion, frozen in this rictus that revealed nothing of what remained of my inner life, and I tried to smile, to prove to myself that I still could, but the muscles would not respond, and I stood there attempting various expressions with increasing desperation, and all of them looked the same, this horrible blank stare, and I realized I had lost the ability to show what I feel if I still feel anything, and perhaps that is the rot's greatest victory, not destroying us but isolating us so completely that even our faces become barriers rather than bridges. There was a woman at the edge of camp yesterday, I think, though I cannot be certain. The figure was too distant and the haze too thick, but I watched her for an hour as she stood perfectly still, and I wanted to approach her, to ask who she was and what she was doing in this place, but my legs would not move, and eventually she turned and walked away, dissolving into the crimson fog, and I am still not sure if she was real, or if my mind has begun conjuring people to fill the terrible loneliness, and I find I do not care about the answer, because even an imagined presence is better than this isolation. We found a cache of weapons yesterday, perfectly preserved swords and spears and bows that gleamed like they had just been forged, and we distributed them among the unit, replacing our corroded gear with these pristine tools, and for a few hours I felt almost optimistic, thinking that perhaps with proper equipment we might achieve something, but then I looked at the hands holding these perfect weapons, my hands rotted and weak and barely able to maintain grip, and I understood that the problem was not our equipment but ourselves. We are the broken tools. No amount of maintenance can fix what we have become. The new sword felt wrong in my grip, too light, too balanced, made for a warrior who still had strength and speed and coordination, and during our next engagement I found myself unable to use it properly, my corrupted reflexes too slow, my timing too far off, and I dropped it and retrieved my old corroded blade because at least that weapon had adjusted to my degradation, its weight and balance matching my diminished capabilities, and I think there is a lesson in this, that we become suited to our suffering, that we adapt to horror until we can no longer function without it. I have started talking to the rot itself, addressing it directly as if it could hear and understand, and I know this marks me as insane, but sanity seems like an overrated virtue in a place where reality itself has become unreliable, and my conversations with the rot are more honest than any I have with my fellow soldiers. I tell it that I hate it, that I want it to finish its work or release me, that this half-state is unbearable, and sometimes I imagine it responds, whispering in a voice like wind through diseased trees, telling me that it will never finish, that its purpose is not completion but continuation, endless transformation without resolution. There are legends among the soldiers, stories passed between men during the brief rest periods about a place called the Halig Tree, a sanctuary where the rot can be cured or at least managed, where Miquella the Unalloyed has developed some means of halting corruption, and these stories spread like their own kind of infection, hope as toxic as despair. And I have watched men desert in search of this mythical refuge, walking off into the wastes with nothing but faith, and I have never seen any of them return. And I do not know if this means they found what they were looking for, or if simply died differently. The idea of cure is almost offensive at this stage, implies that what we have become can somehow be reversed, that the rot has not fundamentally rewritten us at a level too deep for healing. And even if such a cure existed, I am not sure I would want it, because what would be left after the rot was removed, what would remain when you subtract the corruption from someone who has been corrupted so thoroughly that corruption defines them? Would there be anything at all, or just an empty space in the shape of a man? We captured a clean rot knight yesterday, surrounded and disarmed her through sheer numbers, and Captain Jeren wanted to interrogate her, to learn about enemy plans and movements, and she stood before us silent and dignified even in defeat, and Jeren asked his questions, but she did not respond, and he grew frustrated and threatened her with various tortures, and still she said nothing, and finally, in desperation, he tore off her helmet, and beneath it was a face as corrupted as our own, maybe worse, and we all understood in that moment that there were no us, only different flavors of the same suffering. And Jeren released her, and she walked, and we watched her go, and no one spoke for hours. I have begun to experience time strangely, moments stretching into eternities while hours pass in what feels like seconds, and sometimes I cannot remember what happened 5 minutes ago, while events from months past remain crystal clear. And I think the rot is affecting my perception of duration along with everything else, that it is breaking down not just my body but my relationship to sequence and causality. And I find myself existing in a kind of eternal present where past and future have lost meaning, and there is only this, only now, only the endless trudging forward through crimson mud. There are voices in the wind, fragments of conversations I almost recognize, and I strain to hear them clearly, but they remain just beyond comprehension, like listening to people talk in the next room through a thick wall. And I do not know if these are memories surfacing, or if the rot has given me some horrible sensitivity to sounds that should not be audible, voices of the dead, or the dying, or the things that are neither. And sometimes I respond to these phantom voices, answering questions they have not quite asked, and the other soldiers have stopped looking at me strangely when I do this because they hear voices too. We are all haunted by the same ghost, even if we cannot agree on what they are saying. I found a book yesterday, somehow preserved in a sealed chest, and the pages were still crisp and white, and the text was poetry, beautiful, elaborate verses about love and nature and the eternal cycle of seasons, and I read it slowly, savoring each word, and it was like water after months of thirst, this reminder that language could be used for beauty instead of just survival. And I tried to memorize my favorite passages, but they would not stick, my corrupted brain unable to retain such complexity. And when I looked back at the book, an hour later the pages had begun to yellow and curl, the rot having found it despite the sealed chest, and I watched the words fade and blur, and I wanted to scream, but my voice would not work. We march past the same landmarks repeatedly, I have realized, the twisted oak that looks like a reaching hand, the collapsed bridge with 3 arches still somehow standing, the crater filled with luminescent fluid, and at first I thought we were traveling in circles, but the landmarks change slightly each time. The oak has more branches or fewer, the bridge has deteriorated further or has been partially rebuilt, the crater is larger or smaller, and I think perhaps we are not moving through space but through variations of space, that Caelid exists in multiple states simultaneously, and we slip between them, and this would explain why we never reach our objectives, why the war never ends. We are fighting in a place where victory and defeat are meaningless because the battlefield itself refuses to settle into a single reality. There was an eclipse yesterday, or something like one, the crimson sky darkening to black for a period I could not measure, and during this darkness I heard singing, human voices raised in unison, though I could not make out the words, and the singing was joyful, ecstatic even, and this seemed wrong, obscene, that anything in Caelid should express joy. And when the light returned, such as it was, the singing stopped, and I never discovered its source, and I am left wondering if it was real or another hallucination, and I have stopped being able to distinguish between. My right hand has begun to move independently sometimes, the fingers flexing and curling without my conscious direction, and I watch this with detached fascination, as if the hand belongs to someone else, and sometimes it reaches for things I do not want, touches my face with a gentleness that feels mocking, and I have started tying it to my belt when I rest, because I am afraid of what it might do while I sleep, afraid I might wake to find it has tried to strangle me or has started pulling off pieces of my own corrupted flesh. We encountered a procession yesterday, dozens of robed figures moving through the wastes in single file, and they chanted in a language I did not recognize, and they carried something on a bier, a shape wrapped in stained cloth, and as they passed I caught a glimpse of what they carried, and it was moving, writhing beneath the wrappings, and I understood that whatever they were transporting was alive, or something close to alive, and I was grateful when they disappeared into the haze, because there are some mysteries I do not want solved, some questions better left unasked. The concept of self has become slippery. I notice myself thinking in third person sometimes, referring to this body as he rather than I, and I catch myself narrating my actions as if watching someone else, and I wonder if this is dissociation, my consciousness trying to distance itself from the horror of physical existence, or if it is something worse, if the rot is separating me from myself, fragmenting the unity of mind and body that defines individual existence, and I am terrified that one day I will complete this separation, that I will become a pure observer, locked inside a puppet that acts without my input. There was a celebration last week, I think Jaren called us together and announced something, a victory or an anniversary or the general's birthday. I could not quite hear through the ringing in my ears, and someone distributed rations that were slightly less mouldy than usual, and we were supposed to feel grateful, patriotic, proud, but all I felt was exhausted, bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the crushing weight of sustained horror. And I went through the motions of celebration, raised my cup with the others, but I might as well have been a puppet. There was nothing genuine in my gestures, just mimicry of emotions I no longer possessed. I have started collecting things, small objects I find scattered across the battlefield. A button, a coin worn smooth, a piece of coloured glass, and I arrange them in my pack with careful precision, and I cannot explain why I do this, what purpose these objects serve, but the ritual of collecting and arranging gives me something to focus on besides the rot, and sometimes I take them out and study them, these small, perfect things that have survived while so much else has been destroyed, and they remind me that persistence is possible even if transformation is inevitable. We found bodies yesterday that had been arranged in strange patterns, dozens of corpses positioned in concentric circles, and they were all Redmane soldiers, our own fallen comrades, and someone had moved them here, organized them, and I wanted to believe it was for burial or memorial, but the arrangement felt wrong, purposeful in a way that suggested ritual rather than respect, and we stood there debating what to do and ultimately did nothing, just added the location to our mental map of places, to avoid another mystery in a land that has become nothing but mystery. The rot has reached my lungs now. I feel it every time I breathe, a crackling sensation like wet paper tearing, and I cough frequently, bringing up substances I cannot identify and do not want to examine too closely, and my breathing has become work, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, and I wonder how much longer I can sustain this, how many more breaths my corrupted lungs can manage, and part of me hopes the answer is not many, hopes for suffocation as a release, but I know the rot will not grant me that mercy. It will keep me breathing just barely, just enough to sustain consciousness, because prolonging awareness seems to be its primary function. I saw my name yesterday carved into a stone near our encampment, and below my name was a date, and I realized I was looking at my grave, that someone had decided I was dead and had memorialized, stood there staring at this stone, wondering if they were right, if I am dead and simply have not realized it yet, if what I think of as life is actually some form of posthumous. And I tried to remember if there had been a moment transition, a point where life became death, but my memory is too fragmented, too corrupted, and I cannot say with certainty that I am alive, only that I am aware, and perhaps that is not the same thing. There are structures in the distance that I swear move when I am not looking directly at them, towers and ruins that seem to relocate themselves, and I have tried to track them, to catch them in motion, but they remain still whenever I focus on them, and yet their positions change, and I wonder if this is a feature of Caelid or a symptom of my degrading perception, if the land really does rearrange itself, or if my corrupted brain can no longer process spatial relationships consistently, and either explanation is equally disturbing. We passed through a grove yesterday where the trees had faces, or what looked like faces, knots and burls arranged to suggest eyes and mouths, and as we walked beneath them I heard weeping, the sound coming from the trees themselves, and I wanted to dismiss this as wind through branches, but the sound was too clearly articulated, too obviously language, even though I could not make out the words, and I think perhaps the rot transforms people into other things, not just corrupts flesh, but reshapes it entirely, and these trees are what remains of people who wandered too far into Caelid, transformed and rooted and trapped in eternal lamentation. My memories are becoming unreliable. I remember events that contradict each other. I remember having children, but also remember being too young to marry. I remember dying in battle 6 different ways, and each memory feels equally authentic, equally false, and I am losing the ability to distinguish between what actually happened and what might have happened, or what I wish had happened, and I think this is how identity dies, not all at once, but gradually, memory by memory, until nothing remains but a collection of contradictory stories with no core narrative to hold them together. There was a man yesterday who looked exactly like me, same armor, same corrupted features, same degraded posture, and we stood facing each other for a long moment, and neither of us spoke, because what was there to say? And I wondered if he was real or a hallucination, a mirror, or a twin or a future version of myself somehow displaced in time, and eventually he turned and walked away, merging with the column of soldiers, and I looked for him afterward, but could not find him, could not even be certain which direction he had gone, and I am left wondering if I imagined the entire encounter, or if there are multiple versions of me shambling through Caelid, all of us equally lost. The supply lines have failed completely now. We subsist on whatever we can scavenge, and yesterday I ate something I found growing on a corpse, fungal growth that might have been poisonous in any other context, but here poison is a relative concept. We are already so corrupted that toxins make little difference, and the fungus tasted like copper and decay, but it filled my stomach, and that is all I can ask for anymore: sustenance without nourishment, calories without satisfaction, the maintenance of biological processes that serve no purpose beyond their own continuation. I have begun to forget words. Simple, common words that I have used my entire life suddenly become inaccessible, and I find myself describing things in roundabout ways, talking around the absent vocabulary, and conversations become exercises in frustration as I search for terms that have vanished from my mind, and I wonder what else is disappearing, what other knowledge and capacity is being quietly erased, and I fear that language will be among the last things I lose, that I will remain conscious long after I lose the ability to articulate that consciousness, trapped in wordless awareness. There was a battle yesterday, or maybe it was last week. Time has become difficult to track, and I fought beside soldiers I have never seen before wearing armor from a different era, and we were attacking a fortress that I remember having fallen years ago, and the entire experience had a quality of reenactment, as if we were performing a battle rather than fighting one, going through motions that had been scripted by forces we could not perceive, and when the battle ended, I could not remember who had won, or if winning even meant anything in that context. I found a letter I had written months ago, addressed to someone whose name I no longer recognize, and the letter spoke of hope and plans for after the war, and the handwriting was mine, but the sentiments seemed alien, as if they had been written by a completely different person, and I suppose they were. The me who wrote that letter no longer exists, has been replaced by this shuffling, degraded thing, and I burned the letter not out of anger but out of mercy. Some messages should not survive. Their authors, some promises are better forgotten than broken. The night sky has changed, I have noticed, the stars arranged differently than I remember. And I have asked other soldiers if they notice this, and they look at me with blank incomprehension, and I wonder if the stars really have changed, or if my perception has degraded to the point where I can no longer process astronomical patterns correctly, and either way the effect is the same. The heavens themselves have become unfamiliar, and I am lost not just geographically but cosmically, unable to orient myself by any reliable landmark. There are days when I feel almost normal, almost human, when the pain recedes to manageable levels and my thoughts achieve something like clarity, and on these days I allow myself to imagine futures, scenarios where I somehow survive and escape Caelid, and return to whatever life I once had. But these fantasies are more painful than comforting, because they highlight just how far I have fallen, how impossible return has become, and I have learned to suppress them, to focus only on the immediate moment, because hope has revealed itself to be just another form of torture. We encountered a group of travelers yesterday, tarnished, seeking to challenge the general, and they were fresh and clean and horrifyingly intact, and they looked at us with expressions I could not quite read, pity maybe, or disgust, or fear. And one of them offered me water from a clean flask, and I took it and drank, and it tasted like nothing, my corrupted tongue unable to register purity, and I handed back the flask and tried to warn them to leave, to flee Caelid before it claimed them too. But my voice came out as just a rasp, incomprehensible, and they moved on, and I knew I would see them again, transformed, added to our shambling ranks. My sense of purpose has evaporated completely. I no longer remember what we are fighting for, what objective we are trying to achieve, and when I ask other soldiers, they give me empty platitudes about duty and honor, words that have been repeated so many times they have lost all meaning. And I think perhaps there never was a purpose. Perhaps we are just moving, because movement is the only alternative to collapse, maintaining the fiction of military discipline, because without it we would have to confront the reality of our purposelessness. There was a woman in our unit once, I think, a warrior who fought with 2 curved swords, and she was faster than any of us, more skilled, and I remember admiring her, perhaps loving her in the way soldiers love their comrades. But when I look around now, I cannot find her, and no one else seems to remember her either, and I am left wondering if she ever existed or if my mind has invented her, a phantom companion, to make the isolation more bearable, and I cannot decide which explanation is more disturbing, that she was real and has been forgotten, or that she never existed at all. The rot speaks to me now, I am certain of this, not in words but in sensations, pulses of meaning that bypass language entirely, and it tells me things about the nature of existence, about how transformation is the only reality, how permanence is an illusion humans invented to make the horror of flux manageable. And I do not want to listen, but I cannot help it because the rot is inside me, whispering directly into my consciousness, and its message is seductive in its nihilism, the promise that nothing matters because nothing lasts, that suffering is temporary, not because it ends, but because the sufferer changes into something that can no longer comprehend suffering as suffering. We found the remains of a caravan yesterday, wagons overturned and goods scattered, and among the debris were toys, children's playthings, and I picked up a small wooden horse and held it in my corroded hands, and something broke inside me, some last barrier of emotional defense, and I knelt there in the mud, clutching this toy and sobbing, not crying, because crying produces tears, and I have no tears left, but sobbing, my whole body convulsing with grief for children I never met, for innocence destroyed, for a world where children had toys and caravans carried goods, and life proceeded according to rules that made sense. And when the sobbing finally stopped, I placed the toy carefully back where I had found it, a small gesture of respect for what was lost. I have stopped sleeping, or perhaps I sleep without knowing it. The boundary between waking and dreaming has dissolved, and I experience reality as a continuous stream of images and sensations without clear transitions, and sometimes I am walking, and suddenly I am lying down, or I am eating, and then I am fighting, and I have lost the ability to distinguish between states of consciousness, and perhaps this is the final stage before complete transformation, when the last structures of selfhood collapse and there is only experience without experiencer, moments without someone to experience them. The war has become eternal. I understand this now. With absolute certainty, it will never end because ending is not its purpose. It exists to perpetuate itself, to provide context for suffering. And we are not soldiers fighting for victory, but ingredients in a ritual whose meaning we cannot comprehend. And the general is not our commander, but the central figure in this ritual. And Khalid is not a battlefield, but a temple, and we worship here, not through prayer, but through our degradation, offering our slow dissolution as tribute to gods we never chose and would not recognize if we saw them. There are others like me, I have realized, soldiers who have reached this level of degradation, but retained some spark of awareness, and we recognize each other without speaking, a glance or a gesture, sufficient to communicate our shared understanding. And there is a horrible comfort in this recognition, knowing that I am not alone in this particular hell, that others have traveled this far into rot and remained conscious, and yet this comfort is poisoned by the knowledge that we cannot help each other, that we are each trapped in our own dissolution, and our solidarity is purely aesthetic, observers of mutual suffering without any capacity for intervention or relief.